So, if my title seems incongruous, that's because we have inherited an idea of wilderness as pristine, untouched landscapes that owes a great deal to romanticism, but more in the William Wordsworth tradition of seeking nature with a capital N, that seems a bit out of place in the ballrooms of Bath, or even the gardens and manicured landscapes of Jane Austen. However, the word wilderness recurs throughout Austen's works. And in the next few minutes, I want to trace a kind of alternative genealogy of the idea of wilderness as it comes out of these estates that are the settings for most of Jane Austen's novels. The estates are both the source of wealth and also the sort of model of taste. That's where all of those pounds that everyone is always talking about come from. But at the same time, it is when she's visiting Pemberley and looking at the sort of tastefully managed estate that Elizabeth Bennet, of course, comes to the sense that being mistress of Pemberley would be something. 18th century, 18th and early 19th century landscape architecture totally transformed the landscapes of these estates. Everything was managed, everything was put in its place. Rivers were moved, streams or ponds were moved, hills were moved, all by hand. There was an area known as the wilderness that sort of skirts the edge of the garden that's closest to the house. All of this, of course, being maintained by hand by an incredible number of people, but all designed to hide the fact that this is an economically productive landscape. So not only are you trying to not see the gardeners who are doing all of this work, but the design for the landscape architecture, and this is by Humphrey Repton, who's one of the prominent architects. You can see in the top image, this is a before and after. What's been obscured in the after to the bottom is the fact that these are fields that are actively being worked, and then you get an explicitly aesthetic landscape at the end. Austen is both critical of and deeply indebted to that landscape architecture tradition. Especially, one of her debts is especially in terms of point of view. You can map a lot of the scenes in her novels according to people's lines of sight from where they're standing, especially outside. She's also indebted to the rise of greenhouses and especially the trade in exotic plants, growing orchids and other flowers. This is the botanical gardens at Kew, but a lot of the estates also added greenhouses, and the greenhouses or glass houses were both the kind of epitome of the control of nature that is elsewhere legible in the landscape, and also the point at which people, including Austen, started to fear that it was going a bit too far, that this is actually unnatural at this point. Nonetheless, there's this transformation of the landscape often served to keep a certain kind of modernity at bay. So this is going to be another before and after image where you see the manufacturing houses those are gone, all of the riffraff playing in the park is gone, and the fences that were initially keeping the riffraff out are also gone. So that it's all been carefully sculpted to be a beautiful landscape at the same time that it is an exclusionary. So now I just want to change gears for a second and talk a little bit about how this lines up with Wordsworth. This is Tintern Abbey, the site of one of Wordsworth's famous poems where he says that nature never betrayed the heart that loved her. And Wordsworth was self-consciously creating the idea of nature with a capital N in the Lake District, where people went both to see nature with a capital N and nature with a capital N according to Wordsworth. So that there were lots of guidebooks filled with his poetry. So that at the same time that this is creating the idea of wilderness, of nature, this is now, Lake District is now a national park. At the same time that this is creating the idea of nature on which American national parks are based, it too, very much like Austen's nature and Austen's wilderness, is explicitly an aesthetic construction. It is one that we can certainly see in the American West as the aesthetics of the sublime get mapped onto landscapes that are the wilderness that probably pops to most of our minds. And on one hand, these things seem like they're incongruous. On the other hand, the American national parks are similarly based on the idea of we're going to create a beautiful landscape and keep it separate from people, and keep it as sort of hide the signs of economic productivity. And that's great up to a point, but environmentalists are increasingly actually getting interested in the rest of the landscape. What Emma Maris calls the rambunctious garden, disturbed landscapes, places like these are railroad tracks, where you didn't necessarily expect to see nature, and certainly where it becomes impossible to imagine that nature has not been touched by people. And so if Latter-day Wordsworths are going around investigating the urban wilderness the wildernesses of urban ruins, that's actually an abandoned school in Atlanta, believe it or not. Latter-day Austens may be inviting us back into the garden to imagine the ways in which the aesthetics of our own literal urban backyards can be reimagined as habitat